Thank you for joining us this evening as we present part one of the Slingerland Structured Literacy webinar series. What is dyslexia? How is structured literacy related to dyslexia? Before I introduce our presenter, I'd like to walk through a couple of reminders. We are broadcasting on YouTube, and the only thing that's showing on YouTube is the actual presentation. You do not see any names of attendees or videos of attendees, so you can relax on that. All the attendees have been muted and video blocked at entrance because we will want to allow the presenter to have a clear and uninterrupted presentation. We ask that you please stay muted and turn your video off. We do hope to have time for Q&A at the end of the session. So please post your questions in the chat box as a chat to all, because I'll be collecting them during the session. Dr. White will review any leftover questions and provide feedback as appropriate after the session is over. This is going to be a 90-minute webinar, so relax. You might want to take some stretch breaks, but I believe it's going to be good. Now to introduce our presenter, Dr. Nancy Christian-White. Dr. White has a private practice in assessment and remediation of language-based learning problems. She is also a consultant with both public and independent schools. Dr. White serves on the board of the Slingerland Institute and is a former member of the board of directors of the International Dyslexia Association. Additionally, Dr. White has more than 40 years experience in public schools as a classroom teacher and program consultant in special education curriculum with the San Francisco Unified School District. She has served on advisory and content review panels for California Commission on Teacher Credentialing, the Curriculum Commission, and the California Department of Education. Most recently, the AB 1369 Dyslexia Guidelines Writing Work Group. Dr. White, welcome. You may begin.
Thank you. I'm glad to see some faces because otherwise it's like talking to myself. So I'm really happy to see you guys. And I was happy to see so many names I recognize. So without further ado, that wasn't a good auspicious beginning. Okay. So students with dyslexia are in almost every classroom, but instruction effective for teaching these students often is not. The gap between science-based ideas and practices and those often used in classrooms, I'm going to have to move this because I can't see. Okay, are wide and persistent. So sorry I had to do that, but okay. So this is not. You have the outline of questions in the handout. And as you know, part one is talking about the characteristics of dyslexia, what it is, and how those characteristics make structured literacy an appropriate instructional approach. And so, but I'm going to start with phonological processing because that's the core deficit. And it is what caused what was in the legislation for AB 1369 in California. But I'm not, you have the questions, so I'm not going to read through them. So fasten your seatbelt, it's going to be a speedy ride. So starting with this definition, the IDA definition, these are all of the things that are in the definition taken apart. I'm going to go through each one individually, but I'm going to start with the core deficit, which is the phonological component. This is from a summary from Dr. David Kilpatrick on phonological processing. And I'm going to talk about each of these things later, but I just want you to see what and basically he's saying that it would be the students who have dyslexia have a weakness in one or more of the following. It's very well established. Typically a student will have more than one of these as an area of challenge or all. And there's no substantive alternative. Poor word readers, he says, have one or more of these characteristics, and we're going to talk about all of them. So auditory processing is a huge umbrella term. And very often if I get a call from a parent or a teacher, the first time they might say, well, my student or my child has a problem with auditory processing. And that really doesn't tell me very much because it's such a huge umbrella term. Under auditory processing, a subset would be phonological processing, where auditory processing could include anything that has to do with hearing. It could be environmental noises, it could be language, it could be anything that you can hear. Whereas phonological processing relates specifically to language. Wagner, Torgesen, and Rashotte are the authors of the comprehensive test of phonological processing, and they divide phonological processing into 3 categories. If you have the manual, it talks about each of these categories in depth. And those would be phonological memory, phonological awareness, and naming speed. And remember, phonological processing, all of these are going to relate to language. So a test of phonological memory might ask a student to repeat a sequence of words that are unrelated in the same sequence. It might ask them to repeat digits, either forward or backward. It might ask them to repeat sentences. Naming speed has to do with naming objects, seeing visually. Digits, usually it's digits, letters, colors, or very simple objects. It's not a vocabulary test, and it's not, students very rarely make mistakes. It's how fast they're able to look at what they're asking, being asked to name, and how fast they can do that in comparison to other students their age. And it relates more to reading fluency. Phonological awareness is the category within phonological processing that relates specifically to reading and spelling. So phonological awareness could be hearing a word and telling and being asked how many syllables, or being able to hear a sentence and count the words in the sentence. But it's chunks of language, but chunks of language that are larger than one sound. Phonemic awareness is specific to the individual speech sounds within words. And that's the area that is going to relate to reading and spelling. So there are 3 blending, phoneme segmentation, and phoneme manipulation are 3 kinds of phonemic awareness. And students need to have knowledge of this at a very, very basic level in order for phonics to make sense. So for example, if you hear the sounds s, l, a, and I ask you to blend them together, what would the word be? I can't hear you, unfortunately, but I'm assuming you're all saying slam. Likewise, if I have the word check, and I take that word and divide it into segment it into its individual speech sounds, check would be, do it with me, ch, k. Manipulation, there are quite a few different ways. Say strand. Everybody, you just said strand, I'm pretending. Okay. Say strand without the r, and you would say stand. So that's one phoneme manipulation task. And there are lots of them, and they vary in terms of difficulty. So phoneme blending directly leads to, it's something that we would do in decoding when we're blending the sounds together after we've associated each of the graphemes with its associated sound. Segmentation specifically to encoding or spelling, and phoneme manipulation to both. And what Kilpatrick explains to us is that it's this manipulation at the highest levels and at an automatic level. So you want students to be able to manipulate the sounds without any letters being involved at all, simply the sounds at a rate based upon the fact that it's automatic. So they don't have to give any cognitive energy to thinking about it, but that they're able to do it, because both of those skills are at the highest levels, or not both, but manipulation and at all its different levels, but especially the higher levels, is required for decoding and spelling. So the goal then is for phonemic proficiency would be the ability to blend, segment, and most importantly, manipulate the phonemes or the speech sounds at a level that does not require a lot of conscious thought. And then the students are able to use those skills in decoding the written language. So Dr. Tim Odegaard and Dr. Aaron Alexander at the Middle Tennessee Dyslexia Research Center in Murfreesboro, and I'm borrowing their graphic here because it reinforces that, showing all of the things that are involved in the definition of dyslexia, but in a different format. So difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language. And on this graphic, that would, it's not letting me use that button anymore. Okay. Rapid naming and phonological awareness are the two pieces on here that relate to that. And you see that automatic is the goal. So, dyslexia is neurobiological in origin. If we look at this, this is from Dr. Fumiko Haif's Brain Lens Lab at UCSF. Development and integration of phonological, orthographic, and semantic pathways are critical in reading acquisition. And in most people with dyslexia, there's some degree of impairment. So if we look at the phonological and the orthographic, it did come, okay. So you see then the phonological and the orthographic are integrated here. And if there's an increase in that orthophonological pathway, usually that's happening in most people automatically between kindergarten and third grade. We can't wait till third grade and then find out it didn't happen. We need to start way back at the beginning, giving kids what they need and giving them practice if they need extra practice. Then then we have this connection. So the phonological integrates with the orthographic here, and then that integrates with the semantic. And this is just showing you that when we consider family history, this is even before students are exposed to any kind of reading or print. Just looking at the brain organization in those areas that are going to later be related to literacy, without family history and with family history. That's not with any reading experience. This is before they're exposed to it. But this is what they come with, out, or with or without. So it really does make a difference. So we don't want to wait till third grade and find out, yep, that family history had an effect. Let's get started. We want to start way before that. So reading involves complex networking, integration of systems. So it's a language-based learning disability, and it usually shows up in inaccurate word recognition and decoding. This is, most of you are familiar with the Woodcock Reading Mastery Test or the Woodcock-Johnson Tests of Achievement, all of which have a pseudo word decoding task. So does the KTEA and the Wechsler Individual Achievement Test. Almost all of them will have a pseudo word decoding. These are examples of what the students might be asked to read. And these are errors these are typical errors, but I'm just going to talk about one. So if this is what they see in print, there's only one way to decode that. It would have to say plip. There isn't anything else in English it could say. But you see the different kinds of errors that kids would make if they don't have a strategy. So in this case, they substituted a short E sound for the short I sound. Here we have the correct vowel sound, but an inserted extra consonant sound, a long E sound for the short I sound, transpose the letters. There's that place value, which is why the sequencing or the segmenting and blending practice is so important. So kids get that. It matters. The sequence matters. It matters for reading when the words are in print, and it matters for spelling. And then here we have a substitution of the initial consonant. So this is a scenario that might happen at a meeting. It could be parents and evaluator, but in any case, in this case, assume that their parents there and their teachers there, and the evaluator is talking about test results. And the statement is, his decoding is fine. The teacher or the parent, I hope both of them, might ask, what evidence indicates that his decoding is fine? And the evaluator, his word reading score is average, so his decoding is fine. What is the flaw in that conclusion? What else do we need to know? The fact that his word reading score is average doesn't tell us anything about the kinds of words he could read. Was he only able to read one syllable words? Could he only read words that were closed syllable, that vowel consonant pattern with a short vowel sound? What were his errors when he can you figure from that what strategy he was using? Was he guessing based upon beginning and ending sounds? You really don't know. You don't, saying that his score was average doesn't really tell you anything about what he can read. And it's really important to know that, because it could be that he was familiar with enough words to get an average score. But what happened when he came to a word he hadn't memorized? That's what we need to know, because that's what happens when kids are reading academic text, and the content words may be words they haven't seen before, so they haven't had the opportunity to memorize them. So now, I often get some of those kids in summers in our 4-week summer program, and it's usually the 4th or 5th graders that give me that look. And they're looking at me like, listen, lady, my guessing way of reading unfamiliar words has been working just fine. And you want me to do what when we're teaching them how to use the systematic decoding? Well, this is why I want him to do that. What is because this is what happens when kids are relying on guessing from the whole word appearance. So you can look at all these. You see, some of them begin and end the same. Some of them don't, but they don't have the same number of syllables. There are lots of things that are different, and they certainly don't have anything related in meaning. So these are all mistakes. Fortunately, it wasn't one student who made all of these mistakes, but they're all real. I didn't make any of them up. It wasn't necessary. This is why we want kids to be able to become familiar with looking at a word and noticing that internal structure, because that's what's going to make the difference between whether they can read it or not. So proficient reading, according to all these people, and the evidence continues to mount, proficient word identification requires the formation of grapheme-phoneme connections, the spellings and the associated sounds. And those grapheme-phoneme connections are the foundation for orthographic mapping. And orthographic mapping means the bonding of the spelling, the pronunciation, and the meanings of specific words in memory. It doesn't mean that they've memorized the whole word, although it certainly, based upon this, might lead one to believe that. So right now, if you have a pencil, or just jot down as quickly as you can a quick definition, your definition of sight word. When a conversation about sight words is going on, what are you talking about? What are sight words to you? I know you didn't have much time to write, but you know what you were thinking. So I'm going to assume that you either wrote it or you're thinking of your definition. Some of you probably wrote high frequency words. These are all high frequency words, every single one of them. Some of you wrote unpredictable words. And unpredictable meaning, you might have written words that are unpredictable for spelling, or you might have written words that you think are unpredictable for reading. It's usually easier, believe it or not, ultimately to explain why a word is spelled the way it is, but sometimes the way it's spelled and the way it's pronounced don't go together. In any case, there's something unpredictable if you chose that. These are all words that we would say are unpredictable, and many of them are also high frequency. Likewise, many of these high frequency words, some of them are unpredictable, some of them are not. Actually, none of them are unpredictable. I guess I chose I chose them that way on purpose. I just didn't remember. But the point is, some of us think of it as a sight word, high frequency, some unpredictable, and some assume if it is high frequency, that it has to be unpredictable, but none of these are. Okay, some of these are high frequency and some are not. So first of all, because the sight words is being defined differently by different people at different times, you need to make sure that everybody talking about them are talking about the same thing. This is the way the researchers are defining sight word at this point. Any previously learned words that are immediately recognized on sight, regardless of whether the word is phonically regular or regular. I put that part in quotes because that's the way Kilpatrick wrote it. So I didn't want to change his words, but that's not the way I would say it. So I didn't want it to seem that way. So, but it still makes us think of the whole word, or we might be thinking, but it's still saying you have to learn those words, however we're defining sight words, that those are words that you just have to learn as wholes. But that's really not what they're saying. So Jeannine Herron is a research neuropsychologist. She's been working in this area of phonological processing, specifically phonemic awareness, since before the term was even used. So perhaps we should come up with a different term to replace sight words. The words that become automatic after decoding them many times could be called acquired words or stored words. The storing of words that can be recognized automatically is a neural process that requires many trips around the wiring, from the word form area to Broca's area to Wernicke's area. So Broca's, which is primarily speech, to Wernicke's comprehension, language comprehension, oral language comprehension, to the word form area, the speech area, to the comprehension area, to the word form area. But it's not just one place. It's not just the meaning of the word. We're not learning just the meaning from meaning. We're not learning it just from the speech sounds. It's a combination. It's a process. She goes on to say, once the pathways become well established, the route becomes instantaneous, and our impression is that the words are recognized by sight. When most of us on this call, or whatever we call this webinar, are reading, it feels to us like we've memorized those words because they're automatic. My understanding, she says, of work by Pugh, Cornelison, Shaywitz, and others is that memorizing the visual shape, contours, or appearance of a word, what teachers may do with their lists of sight words, bypasses this process and leads to less efficient reading. So it's not memorizing the whole word, and word shapes don't count. Guessing the identity of a word based on its shape is not a reliable strategy for word identification. These are similar in shape, but look at these. These are identical. Those pairs, each of those pairs is identical in shape, but that would not help a bit. If you just look at the shape, you need to look at the letters. It doesn't work, but this kind of thing was in reading manuals when I started teaching decades ago, and I'm sorry to say, it still is. I thought it was gone, maybe went away for a while, but it's back in teachers' manuals again. So the alphabetic principle is based upon that grapheme, phoneme, and phoneme grapheme association. Orthographic memory is not the same as visual memory. Believe it or not, we don't remember words via visual memory. Look at this. They're different colors, uppercase, lowercase, or mixed. We have capital, I said that, okay. Different fonts, different sizes. But I know that words, I know it's fantastic because of the letters, not because of the size of the font or what the font is or how big it is or how small it is or the color. I know because those are letters. That word is made up of orthographic patterns, and I can read it because of that. Same thing for this. And in this case, we have RE, which is a prefix, and we have a couple of suffixes. At the end, we have a base, but what makes me able to read is the combination of those orthographic patterns, which would include the morphemes, but it would also include those grapheme phoneme relationships, because to read it, I need to know those grapheme phoneme relationships to know how to spell it and to know what it means. I might rely more on the morphology. So orthographic mapping, we talked about a second ago. So Linnea Ehri started this, her research as early as she actually first started doing this in the 80s, but it was pretty well established by the late 90s. And so she continues to write and research, and others are following suit. So her theory begins with the statement that the process at the heart of sight word learning is a connection forming process. Connections are formed that link individual written words to their pronunciations and meanings in memory. But again, not that they're memorizing whole words. I think one of the reasons for that confusion is that at the beginning, the words that were used in the research studies were almost all one-syllable words. So they only had a minimum number of orthographic patterns within a word, and it made it feel like it, but it wasn't, or it isn't the whole word ultimately. So the distinctive contribution from that theory. It describes the kinds of connections that are most likely used to remember words when we see them. Sight word reading must involve remembering the letters in the word, because those are the only distinctive features that make one word different from another. So pronunciations of words, the speech sounds, that place value of what your mouth is doing when you pronounce a word, are the anchors for written words in memory. Readers learn sight words by forming connections between the letters we see, the sounds detected in their pronunciations that are already in memory. So when readers learn sight words, they look at the spelling, pronounce the word, and analyze how the graphemes match up to phonemes. Reading the word a few times secures its connections in memory, and some kids need to read them a lot more than other students for those connections to be set. But guessing incorrectly, then it's like going back to the beginning. The way it's going to become automatic is when they are correctly identifying not only the graphemes, but also the associations with their phonemes. And if they're guessing incorrectly, then they're not establishing those patterns. So for a reader with well-developed phonemic awareness, the phonological structure of a word, which is already known from oral language, the words that they've been taught, that they spoke for many years before they started trying to read them, it's the memory of that phonological structure or the speech sounds. It serves as a mnemonic for remembering the letters. So on the path to orthographic mapping, children are increasingly developing phonemic skills that lead to more detailed analysis of the internal structure of words in print. They begin to acquire increasingly explicit and more fully specified representations because they see them in so many words in so many situations. But they're also, as they're looking at words, they're only seeing, as long as they're only reading one language, they're seeing the patterns that are in English. It would not necessarily be in other languages. Now, this is, I think on your handout, that's a T. So I highlighted it when I was going through it. So you can change it on your handout to an M. It's supposed to be an M. So if their phonemic skills don't develop, if they're not aware of the speech sounds and words, then the orthographic representations that map onto them are likely to remain incompletely specified. And then they're left to rely on guessing, either from context or from whole word. So disfluent reading, reading fluency. Reading fluency became a big topic after the National Reading Panel in 2000 because of its connection to reading comprehension. Reading fluency was correlated with reading comprehension. And then, unfortunately, it was attached to speed, the speed of reading. But there's a lot more to fluency than just speed. But let's just start for here. So we're back in another one of those meetings. The evaluator says, her problem is her reading fluency. And the parent might say, please explain what you mean by her problem with reading fluency. Her reading rate based on correct words per minute is below average when reading lists of words. What's the flaw in that conclusion? What are some questions that need to be asked? How accurately is she reading overall? Reading rate is a thing, but reading accuracy is a more important thing. How does she tackle unfamiliar content words when reading connected text? If she's being timed and she comes to an unfamiliar word and she takes the time to decode it, then her rate will not be as fast. But if she ultimately reads the word correctly, that's a good thing. Is she chunking words into meaningful phrases? Is she reading word by word, or is she actually reading the words in phrases that answer questions? Does she reread when what she's reading doesn't make sense? That takes some extra time too, but you don't want a kid just to keep going if what he read didn't make any sense. That sort of defeats the whole purpose of reading. So it could be that a student rereads because he made an accuracy error, or it could be that he's rereading because he realized that he didn't chunk the phrases correctly. If I'm reading aloud, and I'll probably do it in this presentation, sometimes I predict what the phrase is going to be and realize that I was wrong. And so I might have to go back and read it again and chunk different words into the phrase that I was trying to convey meaning from. So how is her reading comprehension when reading at that below average reading rate? Remember, the whole point of reading fluency emphasis is because of its connection to reading comprehension. So if her reading comprehension is good and strong, and all these other factors need to come into. But the other thing is that with reading comprehension, if you're basing the student's skill in reading comprehension on a test score, you need to know what was the output, what was the student required to do. Was it a multiple choice test? Was it open-ended questions? Or was it a closure task? Because some students will do extremely well on one and not very well at all on another. So if someone says her reading comprehension is a real problem, her score in reading comprehension was, or it's a strength, either way. If you have a high score or a low score on reading comprehension that's out of keeping with what you expect, and that's you being the teacher or the parent, then you need to know what the student was required to do, and you probably need to have a score from another comprehension test with a different output mode so that you can compare. And for various reasons, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later, students may do well or not so well on any one of these, and they all can have to do with characteristics of dyslexia. So the research on reading fluency continues. There's a lot more discussion in the last 10 years on prosody and chunking words into meaningful phrases. But fluency combines accuracy, automaticity, and oral reading prosody. So the accuracy speaks for itself. Automaticity definitely relates. There's reading rate and automaticity are definitely going to be related, but fast is not necessarily the end goal that you're going for. You might have a student who reads at a slightly slower rate, but reads accurately and reads with prosody, who comprehends far better than a student who reads really fast, not so accurate, and not with appropriate prosody. So it's demonstrated during oral reading through the ease of word recognition, appropriate pacing, meaningful phrasing, and intonation. And the appropriate pacing, think about, well, when I'm reading something right now about COVID-19, I'm definitely reading at a slower pace because I'm having to understand what I'm reading, connect it to everything I heard before, separate it from the things that turned out to be ridiculous and had nothing to do with reality. And so I'm going to have to read at a slower pace because of all that manipulation might not be the right word, the word I want there, but I think you get the drift. So reading fluency is also a factor in both oral and silent reading. And there have been studies, obviously you can't hear students' prosody when they're doing silent reading, but there have been a number of studies that look at comprehension of students who read with prosody and who don't. So there's more and more evidence mounting in that regard. So we said the dyslexia is going to show up academically in word recognition and decoding, dysfluent reading, and poor spelling. So this is an example of a student. This was an 11-year-old student. He was in 5th grade for the second time. His standard score for reading was 58 with a percentile of 0.6, and spelling 57 with a percentile of 0.5. But you see how these are the words he could spell. But you also see he didn't give up. He was told, it was given in a group, and he was told that if he couldn't spell the word, but he could figure out any of the letters, to write those. And if he had no idea, then just to put a line. And you see how few times he put a line, but at least he did put one until we got to the end. We stopped after 35 because we'd reached the point of cruel and unusual punishment. And we stopped. But the point is he was giving it his best. He was trying really hard. And you see that he just really didn't have much of an idea. Now he was being tested because he was pretty much considered by his teachers to be a slow learner across the board. And when he was being tested, the psychologist asked the question, it was a verbal absurdities test. What's wrong if the sun is shining at midnight? He had kind of long hair, which he was sitting kind of slumped over in the chair at the time. He threw his head back and pushed his hair out of his face. He said, huh, I need more information. What time of the year is it? What part of the world? So there was a lot more going on in that head than anybody had anticipated, but he couldn't spell and he couldn't read. So this was 5 months. This is what he was trying to read, spell, in case you couldn't figure it out. This is what he wrote. This is what was dictated. And this was 5 months later. Now he still has a long way to go, but give him credit. He did get to a whole number percentile, and he did make 10 standard score points in that 5 months in reading and 7 in spelling. I mean, he has a long way to go, but you can tell that this word is nature. You couldn't tell that before. Character, and he's figured out that every syllable has a vowel sound. He has a long way to go, but he's definitely making some progress. So we've already talked about the core deficit is the phonological component of language. And remember, that was phonological awareness, rapid naming, and phonological memory. And then the academic areas that are going to be affected would be encoding spelling, word recognition decoding, and reading fluency. So I'm just reiterating here, phonemic awareness is the area that's going to specifically relate to reading and spelling. And that would at a rudimentary level, students need to be able to blend, segment, and manipulate in order for phonics to make sense, but then they need to become automatic enough with phoneme manipulation that they can do that without a lot of cognitive energy. And just reminding you how these specific skills, with the goal of phonemic proficiency, which is that automaticity with phoneme manipulation. So unexpected in comparison to other cognitive abilities. That means what they're able to do or not able to do may be unexpected in comparison to other cognitive abilities, to other academic achievement, or in relation to classroom instruction that's been effective for age and grade peers. So a couple of examples. Unexpected underachievement. Academic performance is below expectations based upon other cognitive, linguistic, and/or academic abilities. So we would not expect a student with strong oral vocabulary or really strong math problem solving skills to have difficulty with really low level word identification. So it's unexpected when a student is able in these not to be able to do those. Expected underachievement, we know that the core deficit in dyslexia is phonological processing. So academic performance is consistent if we have poor decoding skills in a student with weak phonemic awareness. We expect that because we know that those are connected. But phonemic awareness can be taught. So once we teach it, then we would expect that to improve, as you saw with those students. So secondary consequences, in other words, the main areas of difficulty in a student with dyslexia would be word recognition, decoding, reading fluency, or poor spelling. Sorry, I got rid of that on the others. That one, it keeps creeping back in there. But a student who's having trouble with word recognition and who doesn't read fluently and is going to have his reading comprehension affected. Maybe reduced reading experience, which is then going to impede the growth of vocabulary or limit acquisition of background knowledge. So this is secondary to these difficulties up here. So again, we have the phonological awareness and rapid naming is the core deficit. Then we have reading fluency, decoding, word recognition, and spelling affected. And the areas that would be secondary consequences would be reading comprehension, vocabulary, and background knowledge. So often the question comes up about remediation or accommodation, and it doesn't have to be remediation if it's early. It can be early intervention. But the point is that in many schools, in middle school and high school, if students are diagnosed that late, or if maybe they were diagnosed earlier, but they didn't get the kind of instruction that they needed and they're still way behind, often the emphasis shifts to accommodation rather than remediation. And I'm suggesting that It's not an either or alternative. So if we define remediation as instruction in basic skills and application of those skills that students didn't acquire earlier when most of the other kids their age did. And one example would be using morphology and etymology to teach spelling and vocabulary, along with systematic encoding and decoding skills, of course. Or an accommodation is a provision of services that ensure equal access to a student with a learning disability, such as dyslexia. So it might be extended exam time for a student who has slow processing speed, affecting academic fluency. Or it might be textbooks in audio format to stay current with academic content, vocabulary, and background knowledge to ward off those secondary consequences that may come from poor word identification and spelling. So sometimes, as I mentioned, in middle school and high school, they would just say, well, we'll just give them everything in audio format. We're not going to, but we aren't going to remediate. Well, a student needs, as soon as you realize that he's not able to read at the level that the content is being presented, he needs to have a way of staying current with academic vocabulary and background knowledge, but he also needs to be taught how to read on his own. So it's not either or, it's both. So just for fun, the morphology of accommodations, I honestly see this word misspelled far more often than I see it spelled correctly, which means anybody who's relying on their visual whatever to help them, they're going to remember it the wrong way because it's spelled so many different ways. But there are two C's, not because anything's doubled. The prefix AD, which changes, which changes to a C before the prefix that begins with a C. So you have a C in here and a C here. Then when you add those two prefixes to the base element, this prefix ends in an M. This one begins with an M, or it was an N, but it changed to an M. It was assimilated because of pronunciation. It's much easier. Remember, oral language came before written language. This this base element, MODE, ends in an E, which is replaced because the suffix begins with a vowel. Then that suffix ends with another E, which is replaced by this I. And then you have the inflectional suffix S. So, oops. It's all, so you never have to, probably none of you ever misspelled it anyway, but when you see it misspelled, you can explain to the person who misspelled it. Okay, so some concerns that often come up from teachers. The teacher might say it's his focus, and it might be, but we have to keep it in perspective. This is something I actually heard firsthand. If Joseph would only pay more attention to the words, he would not have such a problem with his reading. Well, that makes about as much sense as if Janet would only pay more attention to her breathing, she would not have such a problem with her asthma. There are a lot of reasons why students with dyslexia or dysgraphia may appear to be unfocused. And granted, there in the population of students with dyslexia, there is a greater percentage of students who also have ADHD than in the general population. That's true, and we always have to consider that. But very often, focus is the focus. Lack of attention is the focus, and a reading problem or a spelling problem or a writing problem may not be getting the attention that it needs. So these are just some reasons to consider why students with dyslexia may appear to be unfocused, and they may be, but is it because they have an ADHD or is it because of another reason? So they may appear to be unfocused because of their specific language-based learning disability. Without efficient strategy, students may appear inattentive or even a little bit impulsive because they're jumping from one thing to another. They try one thing, that doesn't work. Then they try something else and that doesn't work. They don't know. They don't have a systematic strategy that they can depend on. So they try everything they can think of, and when one doesn't work, they jump to another, and that definitely looks different. So they may find it hard to stay focused when the difficulty level of the text that they're being asked to read is beyond their ability to read accurately and therefore with comprehension. They may also have difficulty holding on to multiple parts of verbal instructions. Remember that phonological memory would be the ability to hear a sequence of instructions and hold on to them long enough to act on them. And if they're stressed or anxious, especially if they've had failures in the past, then that fear of failure leads to lack of confidence. Their auditory short-term memory or phonological memory or working memory may become even more compromised. To mask their weaknesses, they may choose to act out with negative or silly behaviors to divert attention. They would far rather get in trouble for being silly than to have to expose what they're not able to do. Not always, but often. Effort. When he really tries, he can do it. And that is confusing to us as teachers and as parents when we think, well, he did it in this situation. Why can't he do it in this one? My suggestion is when that happens, then look carefully at all of the extenuating circumstances when he can do it, and likewise when he cannot do it, and figure out what was different. Because often it's something that doesn't jump out at us, but when we really take the time to evaluate and analyze, we can come up with the reason. He's a capable boy. He just doesn't seem to care. Honestly, I haven't met a kid who didn't care. He might try to make me think he doesn't care because he's frustrated and he doesn't know what to do about it, but almost always they care. We just need to help them figure out how to deal with it. So academic skills, of course, we've talked about, and auditory processing we've talked about. Just a little reminder, I'm not going to go through it this time. So, or I can't read his writing. He should do all his writing using keyboarding. Well, think about the fact that keyboarding is also a skill, and some students have as much difficulty learning keyboarding as they do letter formation. Not all, but some. This was a 13-year-old, and he was referred for testing. His mother had driven him all the way from Santa Rosa early in the morning to come to San Francisco so he could spend a whole day being tested. I'm sure he was delighted, of course. So I asked him if he knew why he was there. And he said, yeah, I know why I'm here. My teachers think I have a reading problem, but I think I read just fine. So while I was trying to think of the next question that I could ask in a way that would not alienate him further, he said, oh, well, I can read what I like to read. I just don't like to read what I have to read in school. So I asked him, well, what is it that you don't like to read? And he told me. And then I said, what is it that you do like to read that you don't have trouble with? So what do you think he said? I know I can't hear you, but I'll pretend. Probably several of you said or thought, if you didn't say it, comic books or graphic novels. And that was actually not his answer, although it might have been. He said what he likes to read is science fiction. And that was very interesting. But think about it. If kids are reading science fiction, probably no one's going to ask them the names of the characters or the plots or the interactions of the characters. They'll read it. If they misread the characters' names, nobody's going to ask them as long as they sort them out, however they pronounce them. And if they misread so that the context changed because they were guessing from context, nobody's asking them any questions. No one will ever know, nor will they, because they think what they read was what was in print. So then I asked him to write a couple of sentences about this dilemma that he found himself in. And this is what he wrote. I think this dilemma is no good. I wish that I could write better. That is how I feel. The dilemma is that I cannot write good enough to express my feelings. I wish I could write better. Notice that he was consistent. He hedged his bets. He couldn't sort out D and B, but he just stuck with D both times for better. So either he was wrong both times or he was right both times. So when you, wait a second, back here. Okay, so one of the questions, his teachers had said, and I'm not in any way criticizing this teacher because I'm sure that he wanted her, he would rather that she thought this, the reality of the situation. He said that when one of the questions on the referral form was, does he use cursive or manuscript? And she said he uses manuscript, but he reverses letters, and he knows I can't figure out what he's trying to say when he uses manuscript because he reverses the letters. Well, he couldn't write in cursive. As you see, his name was so illegible that I didn't even need to cover it up because you can't begin to tell what that says. And it wasn't Tony. I just chose that as a, but so he couldn't write, and he couldn't write in cursive. It was far worse than what his manuscript would have been. But I'm sure that that was what he would have preferred that she think, rather than that he couldn't do it. So I know you know the answers to these questions or you wouldn't be on this webinar, but do people with dyslexia see things backwards? No, of course not. But there are still a lot of people out there. I meet a lot of them on planes and in airports. Well, not recently, but when I used to be able to go out in the world. People with dyslexia have difficulty remembering labels associated with specific letters. And I was going to have a cup and I don't. Anyway, with specific letters that are visually similar, they may lack systematic decoding strategies or reliance on visual memory for how the words look. They often guess the incorrect label for a letter or group of letters that appear visually similar. But that's an inefficiency in visual auditory integration, in looking at something, remembering what its name is, and then connecting that phonological loop for seeing what it is, remembering what it is, knowing its name, and then getting that ability to the oral motor sequence of movements for actually pronouncing it, and how long that takes. Now, I'm going to show you some chairs. Every one of those is a chair, and you didn't have to look at each one carefully to know that. However, if you look really carefully, you'll see that I didn't manage to get all of them exactly together into one piece, but I did my best. The point is that a chair is a chair, whether it's upside down, sideways, and it wouldn't be something that you would confuse. Now, what I don't have, but I probably couldn't figure out how to share two anyway, but imagine that you have a mug in your hand. It's just a regular old mug with a handle, and you're holding it, and the mug is, the handle's to your right. And then you switch it, so the handle is to your left. Are you visualizing that? Well, it was still a mug when you turned it, right? Turn it upside down now. It's still a mug. And then if you put the handle back on the other side and it's still upside down, it's still a mug. But a B, a D, a P, and a Q don't change any more than the orientation of that imaginary mug. And they all have different names. So the inefficiency in labeling, that visual auditory integration, is often the culprit, not that they don't remember what the letter looks like. They can see it, and they see that it's different, they just don't remember its name. So, aspects of reading to consider. I'm not going to go through each of these. It's in your handout, but I'm not going to go through each of them. I'm just going to pick out a couple to focus on. One is reading fluency, and we've already talked about the importance of prosody. As Beth Slingerland said once, probably more than once, probably a lot of times, speed is not the road to success. Careful practice is the road to speed. So reading fluency is much more than speed. And the way we get to a faster rate is not just by practicing going faster, but putting all these skills together. And if we read so fast that there's no prosody, then the meaning's going out the window. And if the purpose of reading faster is to comprehend, then we've defeated our purpose. But it is important when somebody says it's his reading fluency, remember those questions that need to be asked. So reading comprehension, I'm just reminding you that the variety of response modes is important. Some students prefer open-ended answers because they don't have to choose specific words. They can put the words together as they choose. Some students have a lot of trouble with multiple choice because if there are 4 choices there, based upon the syntax and the grammar, they may not be able to tell the difference in the nuances between those that are very close. And for closure, if they have to fill in a missing word, if word retrieval is one of their issues, and for many, many students with dyslexia and adults, and everybody over 50, so we all become much more empathetic. choosing the word you want at the time that you want it is not always the luxury that we can enjoy, but that's important. And then comparison of reading comprehension with comparable measure of listening comprehension. Again, very often parents will, if it's a call with a teacher or a parent, well, it says reading comprehension. And so the first thing I want to know, if he's having trouble with reading comprehension, if you read the same information to him, would he understand it? And that's important, because if a student understands what's read to him, then it's not comprehension that's the problem, it's some other problem. And it might be that he can't that his reading comprehension scores are low because he can't read accurately. That's often the case, but it's not always the case. That's one reason. But another reason, if somebody's reading to you, the prosody, the emphasis on the words that need to be emphasized is in the oral delivery. If a student has to read it himself, even if he can read every word, if he's reading word by word and not chunking into meaningful phrases, then that also is going to affect his reading comprehension score. And that's something that's not as often considered, but it is important and it can be taught. So aspects of written expression, you have in your handout, all of them, and the ones I'm just going to focus on. Written spelling, and I'm saying that because if a student can supposedly read the words, but he can't spell those same words, then he doesn't know why the words he has memorized are pronounced that way. And if he doesn't know that, then he's not going to be able to use that for spelling. So just the very fact that he can read a number of words that he can't spell gives us some insight as to his strategy, which is not going to work when he comes to words that he hasn't seen before at all. And teaching the morphology and the etymology and teaching the conventions can be very useful. And it also helps with reading. Writing vocabulary. And this is important because often students will choose words they can spell rather than the word they really would like to use when they're writing. And I once a principal of a high school in San Francisco Unified, his son was in my class at the time, and he told me that when he wrote essays in college, he had to choose the vocabulary in his essay based upon what was given in the actual question or explanation of what he was supposed to write, which limits what you're doing. But often students will dumb down the vocabulary not much less than what they're capable of because they can't spell the words. So we should always think about that. And then writing fluency is a predictor of writing output, and that's for both for kids with dyslexia and other language-based learning disabilities, but also for kids who don't have those issues. So automaticity of letter formation and or automaticity of keyboarding using two hands so that they're not looking at the keys is important in order for either keyboarding or handwriting to be functional. Well, see, I just forgot to put the thing back in when I oh, well, you got it without the highlighting. Okay, so more questions of parents. Teachers tell us he's just fine, functioning in the middle of the class, just an average kid. And you know, he might be, but if there's a reason to think that he's having more difficulty than seems to be based upon his ability, then at least we owe him the courtesy of investigating to see what those discrepancies are and see if we can find out a reason. The teachers told us he's a smart kid. Don't worry, he'll read when he's ready. No, the earlier we intervene, the better, and the less there's less to catch up. There's less suffering on the part of the student who can't do what his peers can do, and there's less time for practicing how to use those systematic strategies. So there isn't a study that I've read that has ever said that early intervention has a downside. So if the kid didn't need it, that's not a downside. He may have not needed it, but he's fine with it or without it. If you didn't do it and he needed it, then there'd be a big downside. He can read, but he hates to read. Well, why does he hate to read? I mean, there's not liking to read or preferring not to read, but hates to read. And I hear that a lot, and probably all of you do too. If he hates to read, then we got to figure out why he hates to read. What is it about it that makes it so unpleasant, and fix it. His reading is just fine, but his spelling and writing are problems. Well, I already talked about that when I talked about the spelling. It's the way we spell words is a window into our knowledge of language structure. You can learn a lot just from looking at the pattern of spelling errors. It's really fascinating what you can find out. And when you go back then and look at the reading errors, then you might notice things you didn't notice before. It's his reading comprehension, and we've already talked about that. And remember, you want to make sure you're looking at more than one, especially if you have a high score and a low score, or a low score, a high score or a low score, or both. Then you want to look at the other ways of asking questions to figure out what's going on. And the hates to write is not quite the same as hates to read, but with hates to write, it's usually a little more obvious because you have this visual to look at. And it could be letter formation, it could be spelling, it could be an oral language thing with just formulating the ideas. Homework is so difficult and takes hours and hours. Again, what is it about the home, which parts are making it difficult? And the sooner we figure that out and can give some help, the better. So stress points, I'm not going to go through this because I think my time is 5. Oh, yep, I'm just going to let you see it. Notice that you can tell how old this is because it says junior high school. But you see, as kids go through, the main purpose for my including this is that the demands change over time. So what may have been an issue earlier, you've taken care of that and the kid's moving along, but then there's another hurdle. And the demands change over time, but so do the breaking points. So we can't assume because a student had trouble, was given some remediation. Maybe it wasn't for a long enough time. Maybe it just got him over that one hurdle, but then there was another hurdle there waiting. So this is diagnosis, identification versus eligibility. IDEA, the federal regs define SLD as a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes. Historically, there are 3 methods in the, it's time for an overhaul, but at the moment, there are 3 ways that are allowable for learning disability identification. IQ achievement discrepancy model, which is not used in many places, but is still used in many places. RTI, response to intervention, which includes multi-tiered, MTSS, multi-tiered of, I can't believe it. Anyway, it'll come to it. There it is, multi-tiered system of support. Just should have clicked that button quicker. And those 2 actually RTI, MTSS is a subset of RTI, and then pattern of strengths and weaknesses, which is also used in quite a number of California school districts, the alternative research-based procedure, but you need to use it as it's intended, which is as an alternative research-based procedure, and do all of the parts. But what's important here is that a student, based upon whatever identification procedures are being used, or whatever the guidelines or limitations are that a school district has in their eligibility requirements. The fact that a student is not eligible does not mean that the student doesn't have a learning disability. It means that based upon that, the guidelines and the rules and regulations for that district, the student doesn't qualify for special education services. But he still might have a learning disability, but he just isn't going to get services based upon the degree of that learning disability in that place at that time. So diagnosis is clinically driven and eligibility is resource driven. A child can be diagnosed with dyslexia or other learning disability and not be found eligible for special education or related services. But sometimes the way it's presented, it's your student doesn't have a learning disability, when really it's your student isn't eligible for services in this district under the category of specific learning disability. But it doesn't mean that the kid didn't have a problem. If he didn't have something going on, you wouldn't be there for the meeting in the first place. Okay. So using that pattern of strengths and weaknesses, these are just a few little examples. Torgesen and then there's another, in the bibliography, there's another reference with Fletcher. Use of verbal ability as an estimate of reading potential. Children should be able to comprehend or construct the meaning of what is being read at a level consistent with their general verbal ability. So general verbal ability on tests of cognitive ability, IQ tests, they don't require reading for the most part. It's general verbal ability. So what they're able to do with their oral language verbally should predict their reading comprehension if they can read. And that's, therein lies the question, but onward. So strong predictors of dyslexia. And notice I have underlined typical. These are patterns. I really had a hard time deciding what to call this. As my friend Carolyn Cowan says about people with dyslexia, if you've met one person with dyslexia, you've met one person with dyslexia, because like all the rest of us, every person with dyslexia has his own unique pattern of learning strengths and challenges. But there are patterns that typically do appear in this population. So strengths often would be in oral language or nonverbal abstract reasoning, which could be either verbal or nonverbal, but problem solving, inductive and deductive reasoning, not the kinds of problems that you learn to solve in school, but your natural problem solving ability. And many students who have difficulty beyond belief with decoding and spelling might be amazing in terms of solving problems that no one else has come up with a solution for. Weaknesses, typical, again, phonological awareness, we've talked about that, which would include, phonological processing, which includes phonological awareness, phonological memory, processing speed. Processing speed could be verbal, that would be in naming, but it could also be visual symbol discrimination. So looking at symbols and how fast a student can discriminate and match. So along that same line, predictable strengths in students with dyslexia, and these would be more in terms of academic knowledge, but they definitely connect with what we just saw. Oops, I think I must have by accident. No, I didn't. No, okay, so this is the same guy. Now he's not mad at me about teaching him decoding. He's saying, if dyslexia is a gift, can I give it back? You can't blame him. And then these would be, so then we've got the weaknesses. But again, it's predictable. These are weaknesses that we would expect to occur, but they don't always occur, not all of them. So in homogeneous samples of young adults, measures in which there is much emphasis on speediness correlate near zero, perhaps negatively, with tests that require solving difficult problems, which means taking a little time to think about a problem might be a good idea. So speediness, remember what Beth Slingerland said, speed is not the road to success. Careful practice is the road to speed. In this case, you could say careful thinking or contemplation. In any event, speed is not always the answer. This was a sample of college students. Students scored the lowest on those clusters that were measuring phoneme grapheme knowledge, reading non-words, predictable orthographic patterns, spelling words with predictable orthographic patterns, basic reading skills, which included word identification and decoding of real words, as well as pseudo words, and basic writing skills, spelling, punctuation, capitalization, writing mechanics, and proofreading. Academic fluency as a cluster, and these are really low-level academic tasks. So reading a sentence with not hard words at all, but has something in it that's incorrect, which means you have to read all the words, because if you just go from context, you're going to read it and it'll make sense. And your job is to read this very simple sentence, these short, simple sentences with short, simple words, and answer yes or no. So if it says the sky is blue, is green, and you read it as the sky is blue, then you wouldn't answer correctly. So the only reason I'm showing you this is when in reading evaluation reports, very often it won't get, there'll be numbers in the back. All the scores will be listed somewhere, but when it's being discussed, it'll say within the average range. And it's important to keep in mind that for the most part, average range is being defined as one standard deviation above or below. So this is one standard deviation below, which is the, in this case, we're at the 16th percentile to the 84th percentile, and that would be within the average range. But I want to point out that half of the people, half of every 100 people, half of all the people in these samples are going to be, when they're talking about, are between the 25th and the 75th percentile. So this is half of the people, but you can still be within the average range and be down here or up here. So you need to look, sometimes we just need to look a little more carefully, because if the student is here, he may be within the average range, but he needs help in order to be able to function within the areas that are going to help him with his reading and his spelling. So I'm just going to leave this for you to read, because I think my time is going faster than, well, not faster than usual. It always goes faster than I expect it to. But it's worth reading because it talks about when you're reading an article about a study, that you want to look at more than just effect sizes. You also really need to look at some other areas, and this, and if you, it's in your handout. Okay, so this is another student who, and he was in a little better shape, the standard score of 83. You know what? I think I'm not going to talk about this. I'll put this one in one of the other. The only thing I want to say here is the grade with terminology is to define grade and age equivalents, because they're often used to indicate progress, and they don't work for doing that. It doesn't work that way, because they're nothing more than the correspondence in terms of the number of raw score points earned between the individual and the average raw score of the age or grade group within the norming sample. So they're not equal intervals. So you can't subtract them. You can't say, oh, he was at a 3.2 and now he's at a 6.8. You can't subtract that and say he made this many years and months progress, because they're not, you might have one item that could have you jump up, a year and a half. You can't do it. So it's not an equal interval scale. So you can't add and subtract them the way you can. You can add and subtract standard scores, and you can go back to the Allison-Seidel bell curve to check for that. But you can't be compared with a student's current grade placement, because different schools, even classes within a school, differ. So they should not be reported when standard scores and percentiles are available, and they should never be used to say he made 3 years growth. Look, because that's not what it means. And if I had more time, I'd explain it, but I don't. So dyslexia. This was created by my same friend, Carolyn Cowan. So dyslexia is neurodevelopmental multidimensional spectrum condition. It's continuous. There are various hallmark traits that fall along continuum of severity that are not fixed. So the good news is the traits can change developmentally across the lifespan, but most importantly, they're educationally malleable. We can do something about them. So here you have all of the areas of the definition that we briefly discussed. And these are co-occurring conditions that a student with dyslexia may and frequently will have some of these other conditions. And this is in your handout. This is the oral language. Dysgraphia, and that's a link to a fact sheet from IDA that defines dysgraphia that Bev Wolf, our own Bev Wolf, and Dr. Virginia Berninger wrote together. And dysgraphia is impaired handwriting. It can interfere with spelling, It can interfere with the speed of writing or both. It may occur alone or with dyslexia or with an oral language impairment or both. Although recent research has found that students with dysgraphia do not have a primary developmental motor disorder, they may still have difficulty with planning sequential finger movements that affect handwriting. I'm not saying that the motor abilities have nothing to do with it, but it's a language difficulty that involves motor. People with dysgraphia may have problems with only one or both of these. Orthographic coding and working memory only, which would affect spelling. Planning sequential finger movements only, which would affect handwriting, or both. So here we have a little summary of hallmark signs of dyslexia. Lack of efficient strategies for accurate identification of both familiar and unfamiliar words, which often leads to over-reliance on context and guessing. Persistent spelling problems, weak phonemic awareness, and remember that with the phoneme manipulation, it has to be developed to the point of automaticity. Slow naming speed, which is going to affect reading rate and reading fluency. Deficits in word retrieval. Limited awareness of syntax and grammar, which may lead to disfluent word-by-word reading, lack of prosody. And very often, they have listening comprehension that exceeds reading comprehension. And again, just emphasizing that multi-dimensional spectrum aspect. This is a little girl who's trying to read. You see, this is very old article, but it still holds true. She tries her best to read the word. No self-respecting student of most of you would ever say "v." I know they would say "v," but she didn't know that. And she keeps trying. She gives up. She resorts to relying on picture context and guesses a word that isn't the word, but it does have some phonological and some semantic connection, a little distant, but nevertheless. And the teacher wonders first if this is a vocabulary problem when she says that word, but then she realizes when Amy defined volcano that it is definitely not a vocabulary problem. It's a decoding problem. She doesn't know how to decode. So the role of context in word recognition. I'm going to zip through this fast, but I think it's important, especially now because of so many places where the guessing from context is being actually taught kids. Less skilled readers are the ones more dependent on context to derive meaning. Word recognition process for skilled readers is so rapid and automatic that they need not rely on contextual information. Good readers apply contextual information more fluently, not more often. We all use context. If you see the word her, you need to know if it's her book or give it to her. If you see the word READ, you need to know if it's read or read, and you don't know that unless it's in context. I'm not saying that context isn't important, but not for the purpose of word recognition or word identification. Context clues help skilled readers to predict pronunciation of unfamiliar words in terms of placement of stress. So they may be able to pronounce each of the syllables based upon what they know about the vowel graphemes and the association with their phonemes and syllables. But they need to they use a word that's in their vocabulary, for example, that would fit into the context for placement of stress. But evidence strongly indicates that context is not used as a primary strategy for word recognition by skilled readers. The ability to apply knowledge of letter sound correspondences is fundamental to independent word recognition, which we were defining earlier on as orthographic mapping. Good readers rely on the letters in the word, not context or pictures. Context enables the reader to predict accurately 1 out of 4 words overall, but the content words that carry meaning are predictable only 10% of the time. So this 1 out of 4 would include all those really, really high frequency function words that are shorter. These tend to be longer. The content words in a passage, they're less common. They're not in that sight vocabulary because they haven't been exposed to them as many times. Unfamiliar and must be decoded accurately because they couldn't have memorized them because they weren't exposed to them before. So the moral of the context story. Context is not useful when it is most needed, meaning by those students who don't have other strategies. And so the readers that depend most on context are students who don't have systematic decoding strategies for accurate ID. So I want you to take a minute. Some of you have tried this before. This is an excerpt from a Jack London novel. So that gives you a little background knowledge. And the words that you have to guess from context, sometimes some of the letters are there. You don't have to guess the whole thing. So just take a minute and try to read that. It's okay to sub-vocalize. Well, of course, you're by yourself. No one would even know, but it's okay. That might help. And now I know I didn't give you very long, but you probably had enough time already to figure out it was harder than you might have thought it was going to be. So even knowing that, it was not so easy to guess from context. I'm going to make that assumption because I've never known it to be easy. There are only two people in all the time, as many times as I've done this with so many people, there are only two people who could do it easily. Okay, so focus on word structure. This is just saying what we've been saying throughout the whole thing, that in order to learn a word, you need to look at what the word is made up of. So that means looking at its internal structure, not just its shape or its overall appearance. And dyslexia and related reading and language problems originate with neurobiological differences, but they're most effectively treated with skilled teaching. Informed and effective classroom instruction, especially in the early grades, early intervention, can prevent or at least effectively address and limit the severity of these problems. Potential reading failure can be recognized as early as preschool and kindergarten or sooner. A large body of research evidence shows that with appropriate intensive instruction, all but the most severe reading disabilities can be ameliorated in the early grades within the general ed classroom, and students can get on track toward academic success. And that's referring you to the knowledge and practice standards, which you can Google for and get at IDA. For those students with persistent dyslexia who need specialized instruction outside of or in addition to the regular class, competent intervention from a specialist can lessen the impact and help the student overcome and manage the symptoms. So this is just to get you, this is what we're going to talk about in part 2 in 2 weeks. And this is what we're going to talk about in part 3 in 4 weeks. And I'm going to let you read this one on your own. And I guess I'll have to wait and talk about this one next time too. You have the references in a separate handout because this is too small in the slides on your handout to be able to read, but there's a separate handout that has the references, some more resources, websites, and I don't have time for this. Okay, so this is a fun thing to do, and then I hope we have time for a few questions. So in certain environments, certain traits can be an advantage. In certain other environments, not so much. In the typical school environment, dyslexia spectrum traits usually are a distinct disadvantage, like asking for something like this. In certain environments, certain traits can be an advantage, enabling someone to reach great heights. And that's what our goal is for our kiddos. Kids with dyslexia are the canaries in the coal mine of our nation's reading instruction, even if some people want to believe we don't exist. And I know we don't have a whole lot of time for questions, but Elise, go for it.
Okay, well, thank you, Nancy.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Our